You are in a sterile, brightly lit room. Machines are beeping softly in the background. People in blue scrubs are moving quickly and deliberately around you. You are about to experience the most dangerous day of your life, and you are not doing it alone. In fact, you couldn't do it alone even if you wanted to. But here is the strange part. No other mammal on Earth requires a room full of experts just to give birth. A chimpanzee doesn't need a midwife. A gorilla doesn't need a doctor. For millions of years, animals have managed this process entirely by themselves. Yet for humans, childbirth is uniquely terrifying and historically lethal. Before modern medicine, an estimated 1 in 100 human births ended in the death of the mother. In the wild, an animal with a 1% mortality rate just for reproducing would face an evolutionary crisis. We didn't just survive this crisis. We built the modern world because of it. So how did we get here? Why is human birth so extraordinarily difficult compared to every other creature on this planet? And why, unlike any other primate, do we strictly require another person to catch the baby? To understand this, we have to rewind. We have to look at the animals that share almost all of our DNA. Picture a female chimpanzee deep in the forests of Central Africa. When her time comes, she doesn't call for the troop. She separates herself, seeking a quiet, isolated spot in the trees. There is no screaming. There is barely any noise at all. The process is relatively fast, often taking just an hour or two. But the most important difference isn't the speed or the silence. It's the mechanics. When a chimpanzee infant is born, it comes out facing the mother's front. This means the mother can easily reach down, grasp the infant, and pull it up toward her chest. The infant is born straight, with no twisting or turning required to clear the birth canal. She is perfectly biomechanically designed to handle this alone. Now, look at a human birth. The human pelvis is a completely different shape. It is a rigid, bony bowl. To get through this bowl, a human baby has to perform a complex series of rotations. It enters the pelvis facing one way, then has to physically twist its head to fit through the narrowest part. By the time the human baby finally emerges, it is facing backward toward the mother's spine. This backward orientation is the exact opposite of the chimpanzee. If a human mother tries to reach down and pull the baby out, she risks pulling it against the natural curve of its spine. Pulling the wrong way can cause severe spinal cord injuries to the infant. The mother cannot see the baby's face to clear its airway. She cannot easily guide it. She is essentially flying blind in the most critical moment of both their lives. And this is why, for humans, a solitary birth is a deadly gamble. We biologically require a second set of hands. We need someone to catch. We need a midwife. It is arguably the oldest specialized role in human history. Long before we were farmers, long before we built cities, someone had to stand there and help the baby navigate that final, impossible turn. But nature doesn't just design broken systems for no reason. Evolution is ruthless. If something is difficult or deadly, there is usually a massive biological trade-off. To figure out what that trade-off was, researchers can't just look at modern humans. They have to look deep into the fossil record. But there is a massive problem with ancient childbirth. Behavior doesn't fossilize. Soft tissue doesn't survive. We cannot dig up a prehistoric midwife. What we can dig up, if we are incredibly lucky, are the bones of the pelvis and the skulls of ancient infants. And paleoanthropologists treat these bones like the black box of a crashed airplane. They take fragments of fossilized hip bones, scan them into supercomputers, and digitally reconstruct the exact dimensions of ancient birth canals. Then, they compare those dimensions to the estimated skull sizes of ancient babies. By measuring the clearance between the skull and the pelvic bone, they can determine exactly when birth stopped being easy and started becoming a nightmare. And what these digital reconstructions reveal is a story of two massive evolutionary changes violently colliding in the human body. The first change happened around 4 to 6 million years ago. We stood up before we had big brains, before we made fire, before we even looked vaguely human. We became bipeds. Walking on two legs is highly efficient for traveling long distances across the open African savanna. But mechanically, it requires a complete redesign of the lower half of the body. In a knuckle-walking ape, the pelvis is long and flat, positioned along the back. But to walk upright, gravity demands that the pelvis become a short, broad bowl to support the weight of the internal organs. The ilium blades shortened and wrapped around the sides to anchor the powerful gluteal muscles needed to keep us from falling over with every step. This radical reshaping of the pelvis was brilliant for walking, but it completely deformed the birth canal, making it narrower and significantly more complex to navigate. Let's look at one of the most famous fossils in the world, Lucy. Lucy was an Australopithecus afarensis, living about 3.2 million years ago. When researchers successfully reconstructed her pelvis, they found something fascinating. Her birth canal was already warped by bipedalism. It was wider from side to side than it was from front to back. But here is the catch. Lucy's species had brains that were barely larger than a modern chimpanzee's. Her infants had small heads. So, despite her awkward, bipedal pelvis, giving birth was probably still relatively straightforward. The baby's head had enough clearance to pass through without doing gymnastics. The real crisis didn't begin with Lucy. The crisis began about 2 million years later with the emergence of the genus Homo, specifically with Homo erectus. Something remarkable happened to Homo erectus. They started making better stone tools. They started hunting. They eventually controlled fire. And to do all of that, their brains began to grow at an unprecedented rate. In a relatively short evolutionary window, hominin brain size essentially doubled. This was the moment of collision. You now had an animal with a pelvis strictly constrained by the biomechanics of walking on two legs. And you had an infant whose skull was ballooning in size to accommodate a massive new brain. The immovable object met the unstoppable force. By the time we reach early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, around 400,000 to 300,000 years ago, the situation had reached a critical threshold. Neanderthals actually had brains slightly larger than modern humans on average. Computer models of Neanderthal birth show an incredibly tight fit. Their infants had to rotate just like ours do, twisting their shoulders and head to make it through the pelvic inlet and outlet. The clearance wasn't measured in inches. It was measured in millimeters. This excruciatingly tight squeeze is the core of what anthropologists call the obstetrical dilemma. The term was first coined in 1960 by a physical anthropologist named Sherwood Washburn. Washburn proposed a brilliantly simple theory that dominated science for over 50 years. He argued that female humans were trapped in an evolutionary tug-of-war between locomotion and cognition. If the female pelvis got any wider to make birth easier, Washburn argued, women would lose their ability to walk and run efficiently. They would be biologically handicapped by their own hips. But if the infant's brain got any smaller to fit through the canal, we would lose the intelligence that made us human. We were trapped. According to Washburn, evolution found a brutal but necessary compromise to solve this dilemma. It decided to evict the baby early. Compared to other primates, human babies are born profoundly premature. A newborn macaque monkey can cling to its mother's fur immediately. A newborn foal can stand up and run within hours. A newborn human cannot even hold its own head up. It is completely helpless. Washburn argued that human babies have to be born at 9 months, while their brains are still relatively small and their skulls are soft and unfused. If a human baby stayed in the womb for the equivalent developmental time as a chimpanzee, a pregnancy would last 21 months. A 21-month-old human toddler is walking and talking. Imagine trying to birth a skull that size. It would be physically impossible. So, the obstetrical dilemma states that human babies are born highly altricial or underdeveloped solely because they would get stuck if they grew any larger inside. For decades, this was taught as absolute evolutionary gospel in every biology classroom in the world. It perfectly explained the wide hips, the painful birth, and the helpless infants. There was only one problem with Washburn's elegant theory. A lot of it turned out to be completely wrong. The dismantling of the obstetrical dilemma is one of the most fierce and fascinating debates in modern anthropology, and it started when scientists actually bothered to test Washburn's core assumption about walking. Washburn claimed that wider hips make walking less efficient. He assumed women were naturally worse runners than men because of their pelvis size. But in 2015, researchers put men and women on specialized treadmills measuring oxygen consumption and biomechanics. They discovered that women are absolutely not less efficient at walking or running than men. Furthermore, even within a group of women, those with wider hips do not burn more energy or walk worse than those with narrower hips. The biomechanical penalty for a wider pelvis simply does not exist. If wider hips don't actually hinder walking, Then why didn't evolution just make the female pelvis an inch wider to stop mothers from dying? The plot thickened. If the pelvis wasn't the limiting factor holding the baby back, what was? Enter Dr. Holly Dunsworth, a biological anthropologist from the University of Rhode Island. In 2012, Dunsworth published a groundbreaking paper proposing a completely different answer to the human birth puzzle. She called it the EGG hypothesis, the energetics of gestation and growth. Dunsworth argued that we were looking at the problem from the wrong angle. We were obsessed with bones. We should have been looking at metabolism. Pregnancy takes an astronomical toll on a mother's body. It is arguably the most energetically demanding physiological state a human can endure. As the fetus grows, the metabolic rate of the mother skyrockets. By the time a human mother reaches her 9th month of pregnancy, she is operating at the absolute maximum sustained metabolic rate that a human body can tolerate. She is pushing the very limits of human thermodynamics. Dunsworth's hypothesis is revolutionary. She states that babies aren't born at 9 months because they would get too big for the pelvis. Babies are born at 9 months because the mother would quite literally starve them if they stayed inside any longer. Her body simply cannot generate enough energy to keep the baby growing inside her. The baby has to come out so it can be fed through milk, which is a much more metabolically efficient way to transfer calories than through a placenta. And regarding the helpless human infant, Dunsworth points out that primate gestation length is strongly correlated with adult brain size. Because humans have massive adult brains, our pregnancies are actually exactly as long as they mathematically should be for a primate of our size. Human babies aren't born early. They are born right on time. They are helpless not because they are premature, but because growing a brain this massive takes years of development outside the womb. This debate is still actively raging today in academic circles. The classic obstetrical dilemma camp argues that the incredibly tight fit of the skull and pelvis cannot be a mere coincidence. The EGG hypothesis camp argues that energy, not bone space, is the ultimate biological dictator. The honest truth is, we don't definitively know which constraint is the absolute primary driver. It is highly likely that both metabolic limits and pelvic biomechanics act as dual evolutionary pressures, squeezing humanity from both sides. But whether it is energy or bone that forces the baby out, the reality of the exit route remains the same. It is a terrifyingly tight, dangerous passage, and that danger forced our ancestors to do something radical. It forced us to become profoundly social. Evolution isn't just about changing bones. It's about changing behavior. Think back to the chimpanzee giving birth in isolation. For most animals, showing pain or vulnerability is a death sentence. It attracts predators. But a human mother in labor cannot stay quiet, and she cannot hide. The process takes hours, sometimes days. She is in agonizing pain, and as we established, she absolutely requires a second person to safely deliver the backward-facing infant. This means that very early in our evolutionary history, hominins had to develop a deep, implicit trust in one another. A laboring mother had to allow another member of the group, likely a female relative, to approach her during her most vulnerable moment. The attending midwife had to understand the mechanics of the baby's rotation. She had to know how to clear airways and cut the cord. This isn't just a physical adaptation. It is a massive cognitive and cultural leap. Anthropologist Karen Rosenberg argues that the necessity of assisted childbirth was a primary catalyst for human empathy and complex social structures. You cannot have a midwife without complex communication. You cannot have a midwife without a society that values the survival of mothers enough to stop foraging or hunting to help them. The simple act of catching a baby required the dawn of profound social cooperation. We often define early humanity by the weapons they made or the animals they hunted. We imagine our ancestors conquering the wild with spears and fire, but our survival was equally dependent on the quiet, bloody work of women helping women in the dark. Without the midwife, the big brain wouldn't matter, because neither the mother nor the child would survive to use it. This shifts the perspective on why this evolutionary bottleneck started in the first place. If the trade-off was so severe, if it caused so much pain and mortality, why did nature allow the human brain to get so large? Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It only selects for what works right now. For our ancestors, the benefits of a larger brain must have drastically outweighed the terrible costs of maternal mortality. A larger brain meant better tools. It meant the ability to track seasons, to remember where water was during a drought. It meant the capacity for complex language, allowing groups to coordinate hunts and pass down knowledge across generations. Intelligence was our ultimate survival strategy. We traded claws, fur, and physical strength for the ability to outthink our environment. But every evolutionary advantage demands payment. The currency we paid for our intelligence was the physical trauma of bringing that intelligence into the world. And what about bipedalism? Why didn't we just go back to walking on all fours to fix the pelvis? Because the environment had changed. Millions of years ago, the dense forests of Africa began to thin out, replaced by vast, open savannas. To survive, hominins had to travel longer distances to find food. Walking upright is incredibly energy efficient. It exposes less surface area to the blistering equatorial sun. Most importantly, walking on two legs freed up our hands. Without free hands, you cannot carry a tool, you cannot hold a weapon, and crucially, you cannot carry a helpless, large-brained infant that cannot cling to your fur. The two great pillars of human evolution, walking upright and thinking deeply, were locked in a biological collision course. We are the spectacular, surviving wreckage of that collision. We are a species of contradictions. We are smart enough to build spacecraft, yet our bodies are still burdened by an architectural flaw that makes our very first day on Earth a fight for survival. The scars of this evolutionary journey are written directly into our bones. They are visible in the fossilized pelvises of Lucy and Homo erectus. They are present in the modern delivery wards and the tense faces of laboring mothers today. Despite all our technology, despite our sterilized rooms and beeping monitors, the fundamental mechanics of human birth have not changed in hundreds of thousands of years. It is still a tight squeeze. It is still a delicate rotation. And it still requires a level of courage that is hard to articulate. We often look at the animal kingdom and marvel at their strength and independence. We watch a horse stand up minutes after being born and wonder why human babies are so pathetic in comparison. We watch a chimpanzee deliver her infant in silence and wonder why our own process is so chaotic. But our vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the very foundation of our strength. We are helpless as infants so that our brains can spend years wiring themselves to understand quantum physics, compose symphonies, and feel deep empathy. We require assistance in childbirth because we are not built to survive in isolation. From our very first breath, we are biologically programmed to need other people. The midwife is not just a medical necessity. She is a symbol of the social contract that allowed our species to conquer the globe. The fact that childbirth is difficult is precisely why we learn to care for one another. We survive the lethal mathematics of our own bodies by cooperating. So, let's go back to that brightly lit room. You are surrounded by machines, doctors, and nurses. The pain is blinding. The exhaustion is absolute. The evolutionary echo of millions of years of hominin mothers is reverberating through your bones. Your body is attempting the same impossible geometric puzzle that puzzled Washburn and Dunsworth. You are balancing the demands of a bipedal skeleton against the massive cranium of the next generation. It is terrifying, but as the baby finally makes that last, crucial rotation, as it emerges, facing backward, unable to help itself, someone is there. Hands reach out to catch. They clear the airway. They check the cord. A deep, collective breath is taken by everyone in the room. The baby cries. It is the same sound that broke the silence of the ancient savannas hundreds of thousands of years ago, a sound that signaled victory over the cruelest bottleneck in human evolution. You survived, not because your biology was perfect, but because, when the moment demanded it most, you were not alone. You relied on the hands of others, just as millions of mothers did before you. This is the true story of how humans survive childbirth. We don't do it with perfect anatomy. We do it with community. We do it with trust. We traded physical independence for intellectual brilliance and profound social connection. The danger of birth is the price we paid for being human. And the fact that you are sitting here today, watching this video, is the living proof that the price was worth paying. Every single person on Earth is a survivor of this evolutionary gauntlet. We are all the descendants of mothers who faced the impossible and won, and of the midwives who stood in the dark, held out their hands, and caught the future. The most dangerous day of your life is the reason humanity exists at all, and that is a story worth telling.